The firing of Artur Ross, Karnisovas, and Mark Eversley isn't just a front office change for the Chicago Bulls. It's the closing chapter on a 6-year era defined by misaligned timelines, asset mismanagement, and a fundamental failure to pick a direction. From 2020 to now, the Bulls went 224 and 254, just over 46%, made the playoffs just once, and are currently sitting 29 and 49, around 36%, sitting 12th in the Eastern Conference, and missing the postseason for a 4th straight year. But the record alone doesn't fully capture the problem. The issue was never just losing, it was how they lost, and more importantly, how they operated in between. To understand how the Bulls got here, you have to go back to 2020, when the organization hit reset. They fired longtime GM Gare Forman, ended a 22-year run, and brought in Karnisovas to modernize the franchise. On paper, it made sense. Karnisovas came from the Denver Nuggets front office, where he played a role in identifying and developing Nikola Jokic, one of the greatest draft steals in league history, at 41st overall. The Bulls thought they were getting vision, talent evaluation, and a long-term architect. Instead, what followed was a front office caught in between directions. The opportunity was there to reset with a top draft pick and financial flexibility. Chicago held the 4th overall pick in the 2020 NBA Draft, their first top 5 selection since 2008. In a class that included high upside guards and playmakers, notably Tyrese Halliburton, the Bulls selected Patrick Williams out of Florida State. At the time, Williams was the youngest player in the draft, averaging 9 points and 4 rebounds in a limited role off the bench. The selection was framed as a long-term investment, a defensive-minded forward with Kawhi Leonard-type upside if everything developed correctly. 5 years later, that bet has not paid off. Williams has never developed into a primary option or elite two-way force, yet the Bulls still committed to him with a 5-year, $90 million contract extension. That decision alone didn't sink the franchise, but it did set the tone. Chicago consistently bet on internal growth that never fully materialized, rather than aggressively pivoting when signs pointed elsewhere. To their credit, the front office did attempt to accelerate competitiveness early. In March 2021, they traded for Nikola Vucevic. Then in the summer of 2021, they added Lonzo Ball, Alex Caruso, and DeMar DeRozan to pair with Zach LaVine. On paper, it was a bold and coherent push: shooting, playmaking, defense, and veteran scoring. And for a moment, it worked. The Bulls started the season 38-21 before the All-Star break, holding one of the top records in the Eastern Conference. DeRozan played at an All-NBA level, LaVine was a 25-point-per-game scorer, and Ball provided elite perimeter defense and connective playmaking. Then came the inflection point that defined the entire era. Lonzo Ball's knee injury didn't just remove a starter, it removed the structural glue of the team. Without him, Chicago's defense collapsed, their transition game slowed, and their offensive balance disappeared. Ball would go on to miss more than 1,000 days, effectively losing 2 full seasons of his career. At that moment, the Bulls had a decision to make: pivot or double down. Instead of re-evaluating their ceiling, Chicago kept the core intact for multiple seasons. From 2022 through 2025, the Bulls hovered around 500, routinely finished in the play-in range. They lost in a play-in tournament 3 consecutive years, never advancing to a true playoff series again. This is where the franchise entered what many consider the worst position in the NBA: long-term mediocrity. The most damaging part wasn't just staying in the middle, it was a delayed reaction to it. By the time the Bulls finally began trading away their core, the value of those players had already declined. Zach LaVine, who averaged roughly 25 points per game from 2020 to 2023, was eventually moved to age 29 while carrying a $43 million salary. His trade return reflected diminished value, Kevin Huerter, Zach Collins, Trey Jones, rather than premium assets. DeMar DeRozan, an all-star as recently as 2023, was also traded late, and the players acquired in return, Chris Duarte and Raquan Gray, were not long-term contributors, and even worse, are no longer in the league. Take the situation with Kobe White. White was one of the few success stories this front office actually developed. A former top 10 pick who steadily improved into a reliable scoring guard. By age 25, he's given you roughly 15 to 16 points per game, about 4 assists on around 45% shooting. A solid, productive piece. And what you turn that into? Colin Sexton, a 27-year-old guard, putting up virtually the same numbers. That's not asset management. That's stagnation. You didn't get better, you didn't get younger, and you didn't get future capital. Instead, the front office leaned heavily into second-round picks. Ironically, this came after Karnisovas had previously downplayed their importance. By the end of his tenure, the Bulls had accumulated around 10 second-round picks across a 2-year span, a clear indication of a reactive rather than a proactive team-building strategy. That's the theme. Even when the Bulls showed flashes, like starting this season 5-0 and winning 6 of the first 7 games for the first time since the Michael Jordan era, it wasn't sustainable. Injuries, lack of depth, and structural flaws brought them back down. They briefly climbed back to 500 in January, but collapsed again, going 6-27 over a 33-game stretch, including multiple losing streaks of 5 games or more. What makes this era particularly frustrating is that it wasn't defined by one catastrophic decision. It was defined by a pattern of smaller, compounding mistakes, holding on to players too long, misjudging value, failing to capitalize on peak trade windows, and never fully committing to a direction. The Bulls weren't aggressively rebuilding, and they weren't seriously contending. They were simply existing in between. Now the franchise turns the page. The new front office inherits a roster that is at least somewhat flexible. Chicago has roughly $60 million in projected cap space, young players like Josh Giddey and Matthias Buzelis, and a projected top 10 pick with a 4% chance at landing the number 1 overall selection. They also hold a lottery-protected first-round pick from Portland, which could convey if the Trailblazers reach the playoffs. It's not a perfect situation. The Bulls are light on premium draft capital, but it's a clean enough slate to build from. Ultimately, the Karnisovas era will be remembered not for what it built, but for what it failed to become. There was a window, brief but real, where Chicago looked like a rising force in the Eastern Conference. But injuries exposed the fragility of that build, and instead of adapting quickly, the organization hesitated. In the NBA, timing is everything, and the Bulls missed theirs.